The theories claiming that man never reached the moon are not just about evidence. It's not only about the errors in the lights and shadows, the flag waving without wind, or the footprint marked without moisture. What most makes people doubt is that the government had very good reasons to fake all of this, as it was losing the space race against the Soviet Union, and the dominance of the world order was at stake in a competition they couldn't afford to lose. For this reason, some people claim that the government invented it all in a kind of movie starring mainly a man named Neil Armstrong. To determine whether the landing was real or a possible propagandistic lie, we need to examine the entire context, as there are small details in this story that might make you see things differently. And that context begins with a young Neil Armstrong, who was born on August 5, 1930, a year after the start of the Great Depression, one of the most difficult periods in United States history. Neil was born in a small town in Ohio. His parents were Viola Engel and Stephen Armstrong, who, after Neil, had two more children, a girl named June and the youngest of the family, Dean. His father, Stephen, worked as an auditor for the Ohio government, a job that required frequent moves, so the Armstrong family relocated from place to place across the state during Neil's first 14 years of life, living in 16 different cities. His first encounter with aviation occurred when he was 2 years old. His father took him to the Cleveland Air Races, where Neil fell in love with those machines he saw flying in the sky, sparking a fascination that years later would lead him to NASA. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. From a very young age, Neil demonstrated an intelligence that surpassed conventional standards. At just 3 years old, he learned to read. During his first year of elementary school, he devoured 100 books, including some at a more advanced level for his age. Because of this, he was advanced 2 years in school. His second encounter with airplanes happened at 5 years old. His father took him to a nearby airfield, and once there, he boarded a plane known as the Tin Goose, soaring through the skies. From a young age, Neil had several jobs, such as mowing lawns or helping at a bakery, and he always showed responsibility and commitment. Although he started working to support his parents, he soon began saving with a clear goal: college. Later, already settled with his family in Wapakoneta, he continued seeking employment and also managed to join the Boy Scouts, something he had wanted to do since arriving in the town. His time with the Boy Scouts instilled in him a strong patriotism and a desire to serve his country, something that would remain with him for the rest of his life. During high school and preparatory school, Neil developed a great passion for aviation. In his free time, he built airplane models, read specialized magazines, and joined a club where he learned to design models that could actually fly. Gradually, this interest in design also turned into a desire to fly. So with his own savings, he took aviation classes and obtained his pilot's license at 16 years old, even before his driver's license. From then on, flying became one of his greatest passions. From there, it's more than clear that this boy's priorities were not to keep his feet on the ground. As his early advancement in school foreshadowed, Neil graduated from high school at 16, the same year he already had his pilot's license. By then, he knew he wanted to study aeronautical engineering at Purdue University. With that goal in mind, he took an exam to obtain a military scholarship, traveling by plane from his town to Indiana. Finally, he secured the scholarship that allowed him to study at Purdue in exchange for serving a few years in the Navy as part of the Naval Aviation Program, which required his military service. The U.S. government summoned Armstrong after he had completed only 2 years of his degree to Pensacola, a military base in Florida, to begin his training. In 1950, he received his Golden Wings, meaning he was officially a U.S. Navy pilot. But during this period, the United States began fighting a war, the Korean War. Let's remember that our protagonist owed years of service to the military, so he had no other option but to go into combat. At just 21 years old, between August 1951 and March 1952, he participated in 78 missions. In fact, during the 7th, he nearly lost his life when, on what was supposed to be just a reconnaissance flight, his plane took enemy fire and a considerable piece of the right wing broke off. His main task in the war was to prevent the arrival of more weapons to Korean soil, for which they conducted bombings on trains, bridges, and warehouses. Fortunately, he returned home safe and sound, and not only that, he came back as a decorated soldier with few scratches. So much so that, by September of that same year, Armstrong was back at Purdue University, ready to finish his studies. Upon his return, he met who would become his first and great love, a home economics student named Janet Sheeran. When Neil graduated from university in 1955, after 7 long but fruitful years, he realized that his field of study was undergoing a significant change. Now, his career focused on the design of spacecraft, while airplane design was relegated to second place. This unusual shift was due, in part, to the beginning of the Cold War. This fact is fundamental to understanding why the space race began and why so many conspiracy theories have emerged regarding whether we reached the moon or not. But the explanation I'm going to give you won't be the typical one from a high school class. I'd like to dig a little deeper, so pay attention. Almost everyone knows that the main players in this Cold War were the United States and the Soviet Union, engaged in an unarmed battle to see which ideological and economic model was better. capitalism or communism. The problem with this explanation is that it's too simplistic, so here's something deeper. In part, it was about ideological issues, but not so much out of love for capitalism or communism, but rather for what each bloc represented. For the United States, communism was not just a different political doctrine. It was a threat to their way of life, their global influence, and, above all, their hegemony. What is hegemony? A relationship of supremacy that a group exercises over others, generally based on norms or ideas. In this way, a state, a social class, or an economic group can influence others or dictate how they should act, think, or behave. On the Soviet Union's side, yes, capitalism clearly represented centuries of inequality, exploitation, and imperial dominance, but it was also a perfect excuse to legitimize their internal control and external expansions. All of this originated after World War II, as a small power vacuum was left, and someone had to fill it. Someone had to take ownership of the world order, and owning that order, in essence, puts you in a position to dictate the global rules of the game. Who decides which political and economic systems are valid? Which currencies are used for international trade? Which language predominates in science? Which culture is exported as universal? Which country defines the narrative of what is right or wrong? And the United States feared above all losing control of the world. The fear was not just that someone would shout, "Long live communism," but that more countries would leave their sphere of influence. That meant fewer markets, fewer allies, and less power. The fear of communism, in discourse, centered on freedom, but at its core, it was fear of losing their dominant position in the world. And that word is important, freedom, because it was morally superior, but above all effective, as it allowed them to present every action, no matter how questionable, as a defense of good. But many times, that discourse served to cover up interventions, coups, economic and cultural impositions. It was called the Cold War because, supposedly, there were no bullets or missiles falling directly on Moscow or Washington, but that doesn't mean blood wasn't spilled. Lots of it. What is often overlooked is that this war did have battles, and many of them just fought far from the superpowers' capitals, in corners of the world where life was more expendable for those at the top. This is called subsidiary wars or proxy wars. They were seemingly local conflicts, but fueled from the shadows by the United States or the Soviet Union, which armed, trained, and financed entire factions to defend their own interests without getting their hands dirty directly. Vietnam, for example, was one of the cruelest battlegrounds. Millions of people died, entire villages were razed, families were torn apart forever, and generations grew up amid ruins, unsure if the next day would bring school or a bombing. In Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion unleashed a war fueled by the United States, leading to decades of violence, radicalized groups, and a civilian population trapped between bullets that weren't theirs. In Latin America, dictatorships like Pinochet's in Chile or Vidila's in Argentina received support or backing simply for being anti-communist. The result: thousands dead, disappeared, tortured, people torn from their homes in the night, mothers who still search for their children today, and countless more examples I won't mention because, otherwise, we'd never finish. Years ago, when I researched this topic, a doubt arose in me. How much can a country gain for it to be worth losing so many lives and so many resources? What do the presidents, the high commands, and, more indirectly, the common people gain? Economically, the dominant side can impose its currency as a global reference, giving it advantages like printing money with fewer consequences and accessing cheap credit. Militarily, it has bases in many countries, allowing it to intervene, protect allies, and influence various regions. Politically, its power in international organizations allows it to make decisions in its favor, reward allies, and punish opponents without seeming authoritarian. And culturally, it exports its lifestyle as an ideal, leading millions to adopt it without needing to impose it. So yes, it pays to be the leader of the world order, no matter the cost. Now, beyond being fought with bullets in other countries, the Cold War was also fought on other fronts, in markets, on movie screens, and in the way we understand the world. And one of those fronts, perhaps the most symbolic of all, was space. This wouldn't bring any literal economic return. None at all. Neither country was going to earn a dollar, improve their people's quality of life, or gain territory. But it did represent something much more important, and I'll tell you about that in a moment. After finishing university, Neil lands a job at the Lewis Flight Propulsion Laboratory, right there in Ohio. However, he only stays in that position for a few months because the opportunity he had been waiting for a long time finally arrives. He is offered a job as a test pilot at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, essentially the precursor to NASA. This base is like Eden for pilots, as it was the first place where, a few years earlier, the sound barrier was broken thanks to the development of innovative technologies. This is precisely what Neil was looking for, as his goal was to become a research pilot whose objective was to advance the science and technology of aviation. The good news doesn't end with the job offer, as that same year he gets engaged to Janet Sheeran. His new job at the Air Force Base forces him to move to California, despite Janet living in Wisconsin, but this doesn't stop him. On his way to the base, he stops to visit Janet and proposes to her. After the wedding, they move to a cabin in California near Neil's workplace, and in this remote location, they start their family. The couple's first child, Eric, is born in 1957, followed by Karen Ann, who arrives a couple of years later. But it's at this point in the story that things get interesting, because while all this was happening, the Soviet Union had been working on its own space program, which was now yielding results. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in history. This was a metal sphere just 58 centimeters wide that emitted a simple beep beep from space. But that sound echoed around the world, especially in the United States, where it was received as an alarm. It wasn't just that the Soviets had launched a satellite. It was that, for the first time, someone else had arrived first, sending an indirect message loud and clear. We can go higher and farther. But that wasn't the end of it. A month later, the Soviets achieved another feat, Sputnik 2, this time carrying a living being. Not a human, but a dog named Laika, the first living creature to orbit in the history of humanity. Unfortunately, this adorable dog didn't survive, but it was another symbolic blow. These two consecutive events caused great frustration in the United States, and morale weakened even more due to some failed attempts and explosions on the launch pad that increased the pressure. For these reasons, the government decided to create a specialized agency to respond with force. In 1958, just a year after the Soviet Union's achievements, NASA was created. The creation of NASA was good news for the United States, but in Neil's personal life, things were not going so well. Unfortunately, tragedy soon knocked on the Armstrong family's door. On June 4, 1961, what was a pleasant family outing turned into a nightmare when Karen tripped and hit her head. When the little girl didn't improve, her parents thought she might have suffered a concussion, so they took her to the emergency room. Neil had to leave a few days later for work reasons, so Janet took charge of taking the girl to her tests and checkups, as it seemed her condition worsened with each passing day. The day she went to the emergency room, Karen could no longer form words, and her eyes rolled back. After a series of medical tests, doctors located a brain tumor in the 2-year-old and immediately began a chemotherapy treatment to combat the cancer. Over the next month and a half, the girl received aggressive chemotherapy sessions to try to control the tumor, and it seemed to be working. The family took the opportunity to return to their cabin home, though only on weekends. Unfortunately, this improvement was only temporary, and soon the symptoms returned. Karen lost her balance, which prevented her from walking, and she developed strabismus. The doctors informed them that only one option remained that could save the little girl, but it was very risky: a new treatment with gamma rays based on cobalt, capable of penetrating deeper into the brain. The bad news was that this ray not only destroyed cancer cells, but also attacked healthy tissue. Despite the risk, Neil and Janet knew it was the only option they had, so they subjected Karen to the treatment. However, the girl's body was already severely weakened by the first round of chemotherapy, and after a few sessions, it became clear she couldn't withstand it. This led the doctors to deliver the worst news. It would be best to take her home to spend her final days in peace. The family managed to celebrate Karen's last Christmas together, but a few days later, the little girl's condition worsened again. Karen and Armstrong died surrounded by her parents. Shortly after this, the Soviet Union made it clear they were in the lead, as in 1961 they achieved another historic milestone. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space and orbit the Earth. Just 108 minutes in space were enough to turn him into a global hero and reinforce the Soviet Union's position as #1 in this race. This race seemed to already have a clear winner, but the United States knew it couldn't afford to lose, so its response after Yuri Gagarin's event was immediate. In a speech that would go down in history, President John F. Kennedy, in May of that same year, launched a monumental challenge: to put a man on the moon and bring him back alive before the decade ended. It was an ambitious, almost impossible goal, but that was precisely what made it so powerful. Now, if we look at it superficially, all these achievements and advances might seem like a simple ego contest. As it might appear, they serve little more than to prove one is technologically superior to the other. It might seem foolish if we consider that billions of dollars are being allocated, money that could well go to social programs or improve the daily lives of each country's citizens, but nothing could be further from the truth. This competition to see who could achieve the greatest feat is important because it sends a message to the other countries watching this rivalry. When a country achieves a space feat, like launching the first satellite, sending the first human into space, or setting foot on the moon, it captures the world's attention. Yes, from its citizens and the press, but also from governments, leaders, and peoples from all corners. This generates automatic diplomatic influence and causes many countries that were undecided about which bloc to align with to see these achievements as a sign of, they have the technology, they have the future. So these feats were demonstrations to help countries decide whether to support the United States or the Soviet Union, hoping to bet their loyalty on who they believed would win global control. And, of course, if they allied with the eventual winner, the country they sided with would reward them handsomely. By that point, it had already been made clear that victory, the greatest symbol of strength, would be putting the first man on the moon. So, in essence, planting a flag on the moon wasn't about colonizing it. It was about marking symbolic territory, showing that your economic, political, and social system was capable of achieving the unachievable. It didn't matter if it cost the same as building thousands of schools or hospitals. What mattered was what it represented. Soon after, with the death of his little girl still fresh, Neil was back at the office, something Janet resented because it left her alone. However, this was the only way Neil knew how to cope with the pain, by avoiding thinking about it. He didn't want to face the loss of his daughter, so he avoided any kind of conversation about the topic, even with his own wife. Later, Neil joined NASA's space program, but this decision wasn't a sudden impulse. Rather, our protagonist witnessed something that helped him make this choice. On February 20th, 1962, John H. Glenn, as part of the Mercury project, became the first person to orbit the Earth 3 times. And when Neil saw the news, he was incredibly excited, as it began to put the United States back in this race. Neil wasn't part of the piloting team for this mission, but his research work on another project proved crucial in solving a problem with the Mercury spacecraft's rescue system, earning him some prestige, and well-deserved it was. Due to the president's promise, NASA began the search for a new team of astronauts who had to meet the following requirements. First, be an experienced test pilot. Second, hold a degree in physics, biology, or engineering. And third, have experience in experimental flights within the military service, the aeronautics sector, or NASA. By this time, Neil already met all these criteria across the 3 areas. In fact, it was almost as if they were specifically asking for Neil Armstrong. Neil submitted his application a bit late, by the way, for the space program and underwent rigorous physical and psychological tests to determine if he would be selected. After several months of waiting, Neil received a call at home. It was the director of the astronaut department at NASA, with very good news. He was in the team. This group consisted of only 9 men, the best among the hundreds of candidates who applied. A huge achievement for Neil. The years 1963 and 1964 were spent in basic training, though it was far from basic. They received classes in physics and engineering, but also had to undergo a series of tests designed to evaluate their survival capacity on the journey from Earth to the moon and back. Among these exams was one where they sprayed ice-cold water in their ears, and another where they had to keep a foot in a bucket of freezing water until they could no longer stand it. There was also the test most associated with space, the spinning machine that simulated the forces they would experience during launch. The goal was for the astronaut to stabilize the machine before passing out. Of course, no one succeeded on the first try, not even Neil, and the vertigo was so intense that he ended up vomiting. Being an astronaut is not for the weak. However, among the toughest tests was one where they locked the candidate in a small room at a temperature of 63 degrees Celsius. Armstrong endured it, sitting in a corner, trying to avoid all movement and thought. Despite the grueling tests, Neil was more focused than ever. This helped him push the pain he still felt from losing his daughter out of his mind, though the sadness resurfaced now that his 3rd child, whom they named Mark, had just been born. But he had to focus on his task, because the United States had just suffered another defeat against the Soviet Union. They had become the first to perform an extravehicular activity, which essentially means the astronaut leaves the pressurized safety of the spacecraft while in space. It was supposed that NASA would send a mission soon, but it was no longer worth it. They had to aim for the moon. But to achieve this, they still had a long road ahead and had to take it step by step. One of those steps was successfully performing a space rendezvous, meaning 2 spacecraft would approach each other during the journey. For this, they created Project Gemini 5, in which Neil served as backup crew alongside one of his classmates, Elliot C., who had become a very good friend. When Gemini 5 launched in August 1965, Neil wasn't aboard the rocket, but he played an essential role in the planning and development of the team, making a 7-day spaceflight possible, something fundamental for an eventual moon landing. In short, Gemini 5 was a success, and thanks to this, NASA was one step closer to the moon. 3 weeks after Gemini 5's landing, they announced the crew for Gemini 8. Neil Armstrong would be the commander of this mission, a great honor for any astronaut. But, unfortunately, Neil's life changed in an instant when he received terrible news one bad day. Elliot had died that morning in a plane accident. Once again, as he did when he lost Karen, he took refuge in his work, but this time he had no choice, as he had a responsibility to the Gemini 8 crew. He spent the next 6 months tirelessly preparing for the mission, so when the long-awaited launch day arrived, Neil was ready for anything. With Gemini 8, it was the first time since starting his career as an astronaut that Neil boarded a spacecraft, but the wait was worth it. This was the most complex mission of the Gemini project to date, because the objective wasn't just to perform a space rendezvous. The goal for Neil's team was to dock with the uncrewed Agena vehicle, something that had never been done before. Neil and his partner, David Scott, needed almost superhuman precision to accomplish such a feat, but after all, this was what they had been training for. On the morning of March 16, 1966, still on the ground, Armstrong and Scott prepared and boarded the Gemini, fastened their seatbelts, and the hatch closed. The rocket launched successfully. Once in orbit, Armstrong could see the Agena from his window and prepared for the docking process. To give you a clearer idea of how difficult what they were attempting was, both vehicles were moving at 18,000 kilometers per hour. At first, everything seemed to go well, but problems began in the 7th hour of the mission. They lost control of the spacecraft, and both vehicles, now joined, started spinning at more than 1 revolution per second. The mission for Armstrong and Scott became a blur. They tried to follow orders from mission control, but they had lost dangerous amounts of fuel, which they couldn't afford to waste. In the end, the mission was aborted, but despite the issues, it was considered a success. The pilots returned safe and sound, and Gemini represented the first successful space docking, even though its pilots nearly lost their lives. Neil's last contribution to the Gemini project was mission number 11, where he served as backup commander. Mostly, he focused on teaching the pilots who would be aboard the spacecraft. After the Gemini project, what followed was the mission everyone had been waiting for, Apollo, the mission that would put the first man on the moon. The first man mission would be crewed by one of Neil's closest friends, Ed White. When they first received the news, both were very excited, as the moment the entire country had been eagerly awaiting had finally arrived. What they didn't know was that the first Apollo mission would end in tragedy. On January 27, 1967, a launch simulation for Apollo 1 was conducted to ensure everything was in order before the big day. It was a disconnected test, meaning the spacecraft had no fuel and all external systems were disconnected. Basically, nothing could go wrong. While the Apollo 1 simulation was underway, Neil was at the White House, deeply occupied with the signing of the Outer Space Treaty by the UN, so he had no idea what was happening. At that very moment, back at the base, the crew members were having trouble communicating with mission control, something that greatly worried the astronauts. Suddenly, a short circuit occurred in one of the systems inside the cabin, and everything caught fire. Since it was filled with pure oxygen and completely sealed, the fire spread in seconds. The 3 men inside the cabin cried for help, shouting to mission control, but due to the communication issues, assistance arrived too late. Tragically, none of the crew members survived. Back in Washington, after the diplomatic sessions ended and while Neil was at his hotel, he received a call from the Manned Spacecraft Center, informing him of the terrible news. His friends Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee had died. Neil spent the rest of the night drinking with some of his fellow space program members who had also attended the treaty signing. As a result of the Apollo 1 incident, all planned flights for the project were suspended for the following months, a period during which an investigation into the accident was conducted and necessary adjustments were made to the spacecraft. The accident that claimed the lives of 3 astronauts led many to doubt the space program. Outrage grew even more due to the context in which this was happening, as the Vietnam War had already caused thousands of deaths and sparked massive protests across the country. This was compounded by social inequalities and the rise of the African American civil rights movement. In that climate, many wondered, why spend millions to go to the moon when people are dying of hunger or suffering discrimination at home? Despite the criticism of the program, it had to continue. The president had promised the nation he would put a man on the moon before the decade ended, and time was running out. Until then, it wasn't certain if Neil would be part of the crew to travel to the moon, but after the deaths of Ed, Gus, and Roger, NASA Director Deke Slayton made the decision. Neil Armstrong would be among the astronauts making the journey. Despite having his place almost secured in the most important aerospace mission in history, something happened that nearly ruined it all. In mid-1968, Neil boarded a training vehicle to conduct a test flight related to the moon landing. Everything seemed to go well, but after 5 minutes in the air, Neil lost control of the vehicle. Recalling that the deaths of Gus and the others were still fresh in Neil's memory, and that death had become an increasingly likely possibility on this journey he would undertake, when the problems began, Neil made a split-second decision that saved his life. Instead of trying to regain control, he hit the ejection button and fell from a height of 70 meters. The vehicle crashed into the ground and burst into flames. Neil landed and, yes, suffered some injuries, but nothing too serious. When his colleagues saw him, they were alarmed by his condition, scrapes and bruises on his face, and asked, worried, what had happened during the flight, as they had heard he nearly didn't make it. To this, Neil simply replied, yes, being a man of few words, and immediately returned to work. They had a mission to complete. Over the next few months, missions 8, 9, and 10 of the Apollo project were carried out, their success demonstrating that the time had come to put a man on the moon. In December 1968, Deke Slayton offered Neil the position of commander of Apollo 11, to which he responded with a resounding, of course. Part of his crew included Buzz Aldrin as the lunar module pilot and Michael Collins as the command module pilot. Something particular about these 3 is that, in reality, they weren't close friends. They described themselves as friendly strangers, but they worked well enough together to carry out such a feat during the pre-launch preparation meetings. it was decided that Neil would be the first person to step on the moon, as NASA saw him as a man with little ego, focused on the mission, and with his feet firmly on the ground. On the morning of July 16, 1969, the Apollo 11 crew underwent their final medical checkup before starting the mission. Once cleared, they were transported to the launch pad. The importance of the mission entrusted to them was evident on their faces. This event was broadcast live, so the entire world watched them. Failure was not an option, as the outcome of this day would shape history's perception. Some watched from their homes, others from NASA's mission control, but everyone held their breath. The ignition sequence had begun. When the countdown ended, the spacecraft launched. The fear of previous disasters was real, but fortunately, for our pilots, everything went well. Apollo 11 successfully exited the atmosphere. To avoid the space adaptation syndrome that many astronauts on previous missions had experienced, they kept their schedules synchronized with Earth's. They ate 3 times a day and slept 8 hours. They knew they had to be at 100% of their physical and mental capacity to carry out their task. After their second orbit around Earth, they finally set course for their destination, the Moon. They reached the far side of the satellite and entered its orbit. Through the spacecraft's window, they caught sight of the lunar surface and were left breathless. No one had ever been so far from Earth, from home, or so close to that rocky body that accompanies us at night. They made several orbits around the Moon to stabilize their trajectory and, finally, were ready to land. But this is where the problems began. With communication and the spacecraft's radar, which made it very difficult to monitor the astronauts from mission control, this naturally unleashed a contained chaos in Houston, as everything had seemed to go well up to that point. The room fell into total silence. The men stared tirelessly at the screens telling them where the spacecraft was and its condition, praying for the astronauts' safety. To make matters worse, an alarm lit up on the spacecraft's control panel, the number 120 glowing in the dark, an alarm neither Neil nor Aldrin had seen before. Trying not to lose his head, Neil told himself that as long as the engine kept running, he still had control of the spacecraft, and they would do everything possible to complete the mission. So they informed Mission Control, in a conversation interrupted by communication issues, that they would proceed despite the alarm. They were willing to risk it all. Now that the decision had been made, the module carrying Armstrong and Aldrin, supported by Neil as the Eagle, detached from the module called Columbia, where Collins awaited them. Thus, the astronauts began their descent, but as they got closer to the Moon, they noticed a problem with the terrain the autopilot was guiding them to. There were too many rocks, which could jeopardize the mission and their lives. Neil made the decision and informed them they needed to find another landing spot, because otherwise, the mission would be at risk. But the mission was already at risk. If Neil and Aldrin didn't find another place to land, it would all have been for nothing. Moreover, this meant they would use more fuel than planned, another risk factor for the mission's success and their survival. Neil took manual control of the spacecraft and guided it westward, but the fuel was running out quickly. Back in mission control, the operators calculated how much time Neil and Aldrin had left to land, and it was increasingly little. They had to do something fast. They had 1 minute left, and everyone held their breath. With just seconds on the clock, Neil communicated with Houston. The Eagle has landed. In the end, they found a perfect spot for landing, an area called the Sea of Tranquility. Upon hearing the news, Mission Control erupted in applause and celebrations. They had succeeded in putting a man on the Moon, a dream they had worked toward for over a decade. Meanwhile, a similar thought crossed Neil's mind. We did it, he told himself. Approximately 600 million people followed every step of the journey from their televisions. The screens showed Armstrong's movements as he cautiously began to descend from the spacecraft. As he stepped down, he uttered a phrase that would become iconic. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Armstrong would later say after the event, suddenly I realized that pretty little blue circle was Earth. I raised my thumb, closed one eye, and my thumb erased the planet Earth. I didn't feel like a giant. I felt very small. Buzz Aldrin followed, and soon, despite their awe and the impossibility of what they were witnessing, they began their work on the lunar surface. They explored their surroundings, collecting lunar rocks and minerals, and even took the time, though limited, to conduct experiments and gather solar particles. Then, they planted the American flag on the Moon's surface as a sign of power and a symbol of victory in the Cold War. While planting the flag on the lunar soil, they received a call from President Richard Nixon, who congratulated them on their bravery. Neil thanked him and exclaimed the great honor they felt at having been chosen for such an important mission. He then continued, saying, "We represent not just the United States, but the men of peace of all countries. It's a vision of the future." With those words, Armstrong touched something deep in all of us. He spoke of humanity, of that feeling that, in the end, we are part of the same species and the same world. And though down there the planet was divided by wars, ideologies, and distrust, the message he gave was different. He delivered a message of peace. Seeing that blue dot floating in the middle of space, our only home, was a humbling slap and a reminder that we only have each other. Yes, Everything seemed like happiness and victory until a man named Bill Kaysing entered the picture. This was a former employee of Rocketdyne, a NASA contractor that worked on rocket engines. But what mattered wasn't what he did while working there, but what he wrote afterward. In 1974, he published a book titled We Never Went to the Moon, The $30 Billion Swindle. That book is considered the origin of the modern conspiracy theory claiming the moon landing was a hoax by the U.S. government. Kaysing argued that the United States desperately needed to win the space race to distract public opinion from the Vietnam War and other internal problems, and the perfect way to achieve this was, presumably, to fake the moon landing. These claims raised doubts in many people who began pointing out supposed inconsistencies, shadows that don't match in the photos, the footprint in the photo, which doesn't match Neil's boot, and finally, the famous argument that the American flag shouldn't wave, as there are no air currents in space. To verify or debunk these myths, I found a chapter from the people best suited for this, the Mythbusters, who dedicated an entire episode to the most popular theories about this topic. So here's a brief summary. First, let's address the photos. The main arguments are the shadow issue I mentioned before and the inconsistency in the shadow lines of objects, something that could only happen if there were two light sources. But let's remember that in space, there's only one, the sun. For this, the Mythbusters created a scale model recreating this famous photo where the shadows don't align. And when they took the photo, it was clear the shadows looked very different in their test than in the real image. However, they tried again, raising some parts of the terrain, since the lunar surface isn't completely flat. After taking this second photo, they saw that, now, the shadow direction had changed. This doesn't completely disprove the myth, but does provide a good explanation of what might have happened. As for the shadow on the astronaut, the team did something similar, but on a larger scale. Their theory was that the astronaut's illumination wasn't due to another light source pointing at him, but because the lunar surface reflected light. To test this, they removed all other possible light sources, leaving only the one used to simulate the sun. They placed a lunar dust substitute on the ground with the same reflectance index and took the photo. When they reviewed it, the results were evident. The surface was enough to illuminate the astronaut's white suit, even more than the ground's shadow. Now, regarding the footprint, the team used some wet sand and some dry sand, stepping on each with a lunar boot to see the type of footprint left. The result was clear. The footprint most similar to the supposed photo taken on the moon was the one in wet sand, which would be impossible on the moon since there's no moisture. To confirm if this was true, the Mythbusters went to NASA's laboratories, where they were provided with a vacuum chamber and a substance that almost perfectly emulates the material covering the lunar surface. They then pressed an astronaut's footprint into it, and thanks to the combination of both factors, the footprint was marked almost identically to the famous photo. They did something similar with the flag. The team replicated one according to NASA specifications and placed it in a vacuum chamber. When they set it up without removing the air, the flag stayed still immediately, but when they created a vacuum, as on the moon, and placed the flag, it appeared to wave exactly like it did in the moon videos. And one final argument. If in 1969 they could reach the moon with that technology, why? Now that we have more advanced technology, and it should theoretically be easier, haven't we returned? Well, the answer seems simple. Because there's not much to return to, and if something is needed, it's much safer to send robots to carry out any required mission. And what became of Neil after what many consider the most important moment of his life? After the moon landing, Neil returned home to his family and announced he had no plans to travel to space ever again. After working one more year at NASA, he resigned. Instead, he accepted a position as a professor in the aerospace engineering department at the University of Cincinnati, where he taught for the next 8 years. But that didn't mean his adventures ended with Apollo 11. In 1985, professional explorer Mike Dunn organized an expedition to the North Pole and assembled a group of people he considered the world's best explorers for that journey. Surprisingly, Neil accepted the invitation, though he chose to keep his participation a secret. Neil continued his life as he had before fame, but in 2012, due to medical complications during surgery, Neil Armstrong, the first human to set foot on the moon, passed away. And before closing the video, I'd like to tell you about a phenomenon Neil and many other people who have traveled to space experienced. A phenomenon called the overview effect or perspective effect. It's a term coined by author and philosopher Frank White in 1987. It describes the shift in consciousness that many people experience when seeing Earth from space, floating alone in the darkness with no visible borders. Edgar Mitchell of Apollo 14 said that seeing Earth from the moon felt like an explosion of connection with all living things, as if the universe's consciousness flowed through him. Chris Hadfield, who was on the International Space Station, spoke of how small everything looks from there and said, "Humanity is just a group of people sharing a rock." Ron Garand said, "Seeing Earth from space made me realize we're all on the same team. There are no lines on the planet. Borders only exist in our minds." And perhaps Neil, when he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," was also speaking of that. He didn't make a political statement. didn't celebrate his country, didn't claim the moon, but spoke for all of us, for humanity. Because up there are no flags, no sides, just one whole, fragile Earth suspended in the void. And seeing it like that, from that distance, without filters or explanations, reminds us of something we often forget, that there are no others down there, just people like you, like me, living, struggling, and dreaming under the same sky and on the same planet. Perhaps that's why it's worth remembering, to look where he looked and understand, even for a moment, how improbable all this is. That this small blue sphere in the midst of silence is the only place we share, and being alive here, now, is perhaps the greatest miracle of all.